Throughout the school year, I published Leveling Up coaching episodes with language teachers. Now, these were teachers who were taking on a challenge area in their teaching or simply wanted to improve in a particular area. As part of this collaborative relationship, we talk through some possibilities and then come up with an action plan. After some time implementing, I check back in to see how things are going. So on today's episode, you're going to be a part of that follow-up. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and thank you, as always, for taking the time out of your week to listen to a podcast about language teaching. Just one of the many things, as I always like to tell you, that makes you an incredible educator. So thank you so much for doing this. And just take 1 second, if you don't mind, and look down at the app, whatever you're listening on, and just make sure that you're following or subscribing, whatever it's asking you to do, so that you get these episodes every Monday when they come out. So as I said in the intro, I'm going to be revisiting some of our Leveling Up coaching episodes that we've done throughout this entire school year. So if you've been listening regularly, you'll have seen that I have published about one a month throughout the whole year. And these were opportunities for teachers to look at their teaching in a very specific area. These conversations were an opportunity to coach teachers, do some mentorship as we continued on even after the call, and so that teachers could be looking really introspectively at their teaching, looking at things they could do differently. And the great part of all of these conversations is that as we were talking and as we were looking at this collaborative relationship, it was the teachers coming up with what their goals were and seeing that they actually have a lot of the resources available to them. It's just about taking the time to have the conversation and to realize it and then to start implementing, but then also being able to suggest some areas to look into. So on each one of these coaching calls, on these conversations, we start by just going through the process of what's the issue, what have you tried, what has worked, what hasn't, and I always ask teachers to look ahead, put on your rose-colored glasses and see what would it look like if this were no longer an issue in your classroom. And sometimes that was the most intriguing questions for teachers, and that really helped us to look at what could possibly be those things. And sometimes teachers had not even actually done that. They realized there was an issue, but what would it look like to not have that issue, and how could we be overcoming that? So as we work through that conversation, I then add on some suggestions of things they could possibly do, and then we come up with an action plan at the end of each one of these conversations. And I like to have an action plan with things that we can do this week that you can immediately implement so you can start getting motivated to continue on with it. And then there's an ongoing action plan. And then following up on those conversations, I send to teachers an outline of what we talked about, some ideas to look into further, along with some links to blog posts or episodes of the podcast that I curated together so that they could have them moving forward. And then after some time of implementing, I check back in again, see how things are going. And that's what I'm actually going to share with you on this episode is my response when teachers are checking back in with me. So I send them some questions and they respond to them about what they're doing in their classroom based on what we talked about. And then I always send them a voice recording back because that's sort of the best way I can do it when I'm talking through it. So I send them that voice recording. So what I'm going to share with you today is a couple of examples of those recordings that I send back to teachers based on what they're telling me they're doing in the classroom. So you can sort of get an idea of what this collaborative relationship is like. So I will review what the topics were for the episodes and what the action plan was, and then I will play you the audio that I send back to teachers when they reach back out to me and we continue that relationship. I just want to point out that when you hear those are not podcast episode sort of quality. I mean, the audio is fine, but it's not going to be edited highly. It's really just responding to questions that they had so that you can get an idea of what that relationship is like when it's not being presented sort of on a podcast. And I'm always looking for teachers to have more of these ongoing conversations because I often hear from listeners that these have been really useful episodes to them. So there is a link in the show notes if you would like to be a part of this process throughout the next school year. I'm always looking for teachers to join me in doing this. And I also want to point out, I don't think I've ever made this clear, but this is not a paid for service at all. This is not something that I am having teachers pay for in any way. And some people have asked me, sort of what's the fee to go through this process and everything? And just to reiterate or just even say for the first time that there is no money exchanged in this in any way, shape, or form. The fact that you are willing to share your stories and have this conversation with me and allow me to share it with other teachers on the podcast, like that is more than I could ever ask anyone to go through for sort of money-wise to go through this entire process. So to make it absolutely clear that there is no fee involved in going through this process, I just enjoy the opportunity to be able to talk with you and then to bring this all to other teachers. So let's start off with one of the earlier coaching episodes that I did, and this was with Tamika, and she wanted to look at streamlining her lesson planning so that she had more cohesive lessons. She was feeling that there were a lot of disjointed activities, so she wanted to have more cohesive lesson plans. So after our conversation, I gave her the action plan that for the first week, so for this week I always say, it was to create a structured lesson planning template with sections for learning objectives, warm-ups, instructional content, practice activities, and formative assessments so that she could start to look at having those cohesive lessons. And then in the following weeks to use her newly designed lesson plan template for all of her future lesson plans and then to tweak it and hone it as she goes through, but to start by having that sort of process. So I reached back out after some time to Tamika to ask how things were going with implementing all of this. And right now you will hear my response back to her. I'm looking through all the information you just sent me back in your email, and you created that Google file with your teacher toolbox with your activities and how long each one takes. So I remember talking about that in detail with you. So I'm so happy to hear that you did that. You're then able to take that and then your list of objectives and from your textbook and plug in the activities based on all of that, and that the system is working out for you so well. I'm so happy to hear that. And I love when you pointed out that you have spent exactly 0 minutes working at home this year outside of, report cards and all of that. So I'm so happy that you're having time for yourself and for your family and to even coach some cheerleading along the way. So it's just great. I'm just so happy to hear that you're doing so well with it. And I had a wonderful time speaking with you. And if I can provide any more insights, guidance, be a sounding board for any of this, please do reach out to me. We can jump on the phone. We can jump on Zoom. I can send you off some resources if there's something specific you can think of. But I really appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with you on this. The next teacher that I talked to was Stephanie, the first of two Stephanies that I spoke to, but this was the earlier one, and we talked about engaging speaking activities for language growth. So that's what Stephanie was looking to do in her classroom, is to really find these engaging speaking activities. So the action plan that I gave her was to, in the first week, start to develop chat mats with vocabulary support and sentence starters and visual prompts for specific speaking activities or on a cultural topics so that she could get used to using them. And then in the subsequent weeks to discover new ways of making the output compelling for students, that they were not just understanding the language, but they were finding it really compelling. The input was compelling and how they were using it was compelling as well. So here is my response back to Stephanie as we continued our collaboration. So just to go through some of your talking points that you shared. So you mentioned using chat mats and other speaking activities, and that's gone well. And that's given your students an opportunity to focus on conversation as well as some choice and language and responses. So that is excellent to hear. I did see that later on. You mentioned it as one of your challenge areas as well, but thank you so much for pointing out that it was there's some success in there, because despite the challenges, that means that you see some benefit in working through those challenges. So that is great, and that students are being less scripted and more on their own, and that you've tried out quiz trade. And yes, I've mentioned it a couple of times. It's something that I really like, so I'm glad that has worked well for you as well. And running dictations and information gap activities. It's just really reassuring to hear that you are hearing these ideas and you're looking to bring them into your classroom, and they don't always look exactly the way we're going to see them, or we hear about them, or we anticipate they're going to be, because we all teach different students. They all have different levels. There's different behavior stuff going on, but the fact that you are giving it a try and you're open to doing these new things and doing things in new ways is really just reassuring and wonderful to hear. So you mentioned that some of the challenges with chat mats, it's ideally everything would be laminated in a perfect world. I mean, ideally, I would say if they could be digital, that would be great. One other thing that I have done that I would suggest, maybe if you have the bandwidth to do it, is that if you have the resources, if you have binders or folders with the chat mats in them, and then you just keep those and they get handed out to students as needed, and they just flip to the page of that particular chat mat. Like, that would be something that you move toward as you create more of them, and you put them in there, and you can put them like in the sheet protectors, not necessarily laminated, but where you can take the sheets in and out, those plastic binder sheets, and you can put them in there, and students can then use those. And it's just a way, when you don't have the laminator, it's another way of doing that. And so I would have like these little binders that have chat mats in them for particular classes, and so they get handed out, students use them, and then I take them back with them all in there, because, you mentioned that, it's not exactly the most sustainable thing. And then you mentioned the challenge of monitoring students to ensure they're on task. That's, again, based on, the dynamic of your classroom. So just, keep at that, and do the speed dating. And, you said it sort of worked. So maybe if you hone that skill a bit more, you'll do some work with that. Again, same thing with the running dictation and the info gap activities. And, you might not find that all these activities are applicable. There might be other ones that would work better with certain classes, So if it's not working because of the dynamic of the room, like, don't force it, move on and try something else. And it might be for one section it works and another it doesn't, because we have different makeups of our students, and that's kind of the reality of teaching. But again, the fact that you're trying these things out, that's keeping it dynamic for you and students, and, finding those things. And then probably the biggest challenge is keeping the material compelling for students. So, that's, in our changing world, and I don't know if you've heard me mention this on the podcast, but when I do exit tickets, a lot of times I will ask students to tell me about books they're reading, movies they're watching, events coming up at school, just so I have insights into what they're interested in and what they're doing. And then I will use that for themes going forward, because I don't always know what they're interested in. So it's a good way to sort of get them to just tell me what's going on, things I might not be aware of. And then, you also mentioned that students, at any rate, I have learned that students are more confident, more apt to say things if they have the written and visual support. So that's like the chat mats and the quiz trade. So that's good. And, just the idea of slowing down that you mentioned, and to keep it challenging for students. And you're figuring out with these activities what that time frame is, like the 5 minutes or so, it's great. The more you do them, the more you're going to learn from them. And you say that students are not always doing, what did you say? have also learned to vary the speaking activities that I do. Yeah, so they're not always doing the same thing. Yeah, so it's about having, your repertoire of all the different activities and everything and figuring out which ones work for certain classes and which ones might not. But if there are any very specific activities that you'd be interested in getting templates for, anything that you've heard me mentioned or you've heard others mention, before you reinvent the world, please reach out to me. Let me know if I can send something to you, if I can find a resource. I might have it myself, or I know somebody who does, and I can get that to you to continue supporting the work that you're doing. The next teacher that I spoke to was Judy, and Judy wanted to talk all about IPAs and implementing IPAs and using world language standards within them. So IPAs are integrated performance assessments. So we talked through a lot of the process of how to bring those into her classroom, and I gave her as an action plan for the first week was to choose one unit or topic from her curriculum where she would create an IPA, and then to create a clear and detailed rubric that aligns with the IPA tasks, and then in the subsequent weeks to design and implement formative practice activities related to the selected IPA unit so that students are prepared for it, and then ultimately to administer the IPA for a selected unit, and then using the rubric to evaluate the student's performance. So we had a couple of times to follow up as we were going through this process, and here is one of the responses that I gave back to Judy. So I see that you're using the Voces program. That's really good. And you're getting into some IPA work as well and figuring out some ways to create the IPAs yourself. It looks like you're using some AI tools as well. And there's so many out there, as you pointed out. So hopefully you're finding some ways to do that. It's all about finding the right way to ask it to give you what you want to do. So hopefully you can continue working with those. And with chat mats and authentic resources, because that's a big part of doing all of the IPA work. And then you also started doing some do nows. That's really helpful. And using some more games in your classroom, just as you said, just anything to get them reading and talking. So it looks like your classroom has been very engaged. So that's really great to hear about and all of those things. And let's see, you point out that your biggest challenge is the mindset of students in your classroom and getting to motivate them, that because it's an elective and half of them are only there for the requirement. Motivation is always a hot topic, and getting students to be as excited about language learning as we are and being the language teachers. But I'll just point out that one of the things with Krashen, with his comprehensible input, it's also the compelling input, and, having those topics that students want to engage in, not just learning the language, but learning about topics within the language. So it looks like you're going to try your hand at introducing language and culture in more authentic ways, and that'll be helpful in trying to find some of those more compelling resources for students as well, and also allowing for choice and autonomy that you pointed out, and just having students be in control of their own learning. So it looks like you're doing some really great stuff, and you have a couple of things you want to keep working on, but I really appreciate the follow-up and telling me all about these wonderful things that you're doing. Another teacher that I spoke to was Lisa, and Lisa was balancing common district assessments with her proficiency-based classroom, and that is something that often comes up with teachers. So this was a really great topic to take on. After a lot of discussion about the common assessments and her proficiency-based classroom, and the common assessments weren't as proficiency-based as she would like them to be, so how do you actually make that work? So we looked at an action plan, with the first week being to review the district assessments and analyze the proficiency objectives in her own curriculum, then to identify those specific areas where the two actually do align and make sure that the focus remains on language proficiency, but also setting students up for success on the Common Assessment. And we kind of looked at this way of allowing for some time at the end of the unit to teach towards some of those things that are on the assessment that might not be proficiency aligned, which doesn't always feel great. But as John Bracey always says, be a good teacher, do all the proficiency stuff, just don't get fired. So sometimes we have to do little things like that to keep up with the curriculum within our departments. But as you will hear as in my response to Lisa, that she's done a really great job of finding that balance. And in the subsequent weeks, I just suggested that she start to initiate those discussions with department heads or administrators to advocate for the importance of making those common district assessments a little more proficiency-based and to present evidence to the benefits of it, to explore those possibilities, and just to make sure that, you know, everyone is getting on board with it as much as possible. So again, this is a topic that a lot of people are sometimes struggling with. So here is just one of the responses that I had during our collaboration. It looks like that the system you came up with did allow your students to get the vocabulary that they wanted and still were able to be successful on your common assessments. That's great to hear. It might not be exactly what we talked about, but it sparked enough where you were able to find a system that worked well for you and your students. And then you went on to point out that your biggest takeaway so far is that your curriculum needs more of an overhaul than you had initially thought. So if that's one of the big things that is coming out of our discussion, that you were able to look at it and have those conversations within your department, that's wonderful as well. And starting to move your more isolated units. Let's see, what did you say? Our units were starting to be more isolated than building on each other, and that everyone was teaching slightly differently in vocabulary and structures. So hopefully this idea of having those common assessments having those common assessments, you pointed out, made you realize that you need to revisit each unit and evaluate the why. And, you know, hopefully these are just rich discussions that are happening within your whole department and with everyone, so that you can all sort of get on board together and look at what those assessments are actually assessing with that question of why. So I think what you're probably referencing is the idea of the success criteria, the what am I learning, why, how will I know I've learned it, and what will I do with it? And, you know, just putting that lens on each of the units and having everyone be a part of that. And as you work into your summer, it looks like you'll be rewriting much of the curriculum with that in mind, which is so great. And that will hopefully, as you say, alleviate the need to supplement to meet the test, so that the actual assessments are assessing the proficiency and the performance rather than, you know, just those lists of vocabulary and those different themes that came up. And then you said that it was a classic moment of realizing your problem was the result of a different problem. So hopefully by really re-examining what you're introducing, then you'll be and how you're introducing it and how you go back to it, then you'll have more proficiency with your students. So I'm just really happy to see, and it's rewarding to see that having conversations about this sort of brought this larger conversation into your department. So even though it was sort of like that original conversation about how can I work within the common assessments and what I do in my classroom, that this opened up a larger discussion and really seeing what the issues are behind it, even though if it wasn't really the original one we looked at. So you mentioned that you're going to do some work with Common Ground, and please do reach out to me if you have any specific questions or would like additional resources as you start to relook at your curriculum and for others in your department, or how to have those conversations. Really happy to do that. We can jump on the phone, jump on Zoom, have an offline conversation about it. It doesn't have to be a podcast episode, because I just want to be a part of, you know, your support system, and so we can continue to collaborate with each other over that. Another teacher that I spoke with was Jennifer, and she wanted to talk about teaching and assessing writing, particularly at the novice level. So we talked about many different ways to approach the topic of writing with our more beginner students. And in the end, I gave her an action plan that started with this week, the things you can do right away, or about gathering resources and compiling a list of novice level vocabulary and simple sentence starters that was suitable for writing tasks so that she could help scaffold the writing with students. And then to develop those scaffolded prompts. So to create a list of writing prompts that guide students to construct basic sentences and then short paragraphs using the vocabulary and structures that she wanted to highlight, with opportunities to go beyond the expected proficiency level when possible. But it was more about finding those resources initially and figuring out what is that novice level language that you want them to use to really hone in on what that was for students, so they didn't think that there was this expectation that there was so much more. And then the subsequent weeks, the goal would be to create single point rubrics that align with novice level writing expectations so that she can assess that vocabulary usage and look at the variety of sentence structures and the grammar things, and to also implement those scaffolded tasks and to introduce scaffolded writing prompts in class and to provide formative feedback. So it was a big, lofty thing to take on when you're doing all of the writing. So I recently reached out to Jennifer to ask how things were going with this, and she just responded back. So I just wanted to tell you that she said in an email real quickly, "Hi Joshua, I've been using the writing rubric with only the proficiency levels that they should meet, and it works beautifully. Most of my students meet and many of them level up. It is super motivating for them." So it is so great to hear that when teachers are implementing suggestions and trying new things and finding success, that it is motivating for students and they're excited to keep going. And then the last teacher I'll highlight was my most recent episode, which was last month when I spoke to Stephanie, and she wanted to talk about maintaining her own target language proficiency and confidence. And so I had an action plan for her to collaborate with the high school teachers in her district because she teaches middle school French, and she felt like she spent so much of her time speaking and using language at the novice level. So I suggested a collaboration with high school teachers and then finding opportunities locally and virtually to continue engaging with the language. And Stephanie just reached out to me on Twitter, aka X, and she shared with me that since our chat on the podcast that she signed up to take a French film discussion class and held a parent-teacher conference in French for the mom from Montreal. And she also had both high school teachers observe her class and that she's feeling confident and making progress in this area. So that is great to hear from Stephanie as well. So I hope that you have enjoyed this opportunity to sort of look a little bit behind the scenes of what goes into these coaching episodes. And I want to reiterate that there is no cost involved in these coaching sessions. So if you want to dive deeper into your own teaching practice, please consider joining me for a Leveling Up episode. Just click the link in the show notes and we can set it up. And you'll also see the link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. So I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, WLClassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.